am grateful that you have prepared me to earn an honorable living, wrote Désirée Dufresne to the benefactors who harbored her after she left prison as a 16-year-old girl. I will explore the destinies of adolescent girls as of Désirée after their prison detention in 19th-century France, as I review 4 correctional facilities for young girls that work to prepare their reintegration into society. I will ask in broad terms 2 questions. Did they succeed in their stated aim? Is Désirée's praise representative? And secondly, how did les jeunes libérées, liberated girls, experience these institutions? How did they react to the measures that were set in place? How did they experience freedom? The law of 1850, La Loi de l'Éducation et du Patronage, underlies this presentation. It moved young offenders from public prisons to private establishments. Young girls, often in these facilities for theft, vagabondage, or prostitution, would henceforth find themselves in private, mostly religious refuge, asile, or ouvroirs that the French state subsidized. The majority among them were sentenced to a correction through Article 66 of the French Code Penal. As in sentenced them to long corrections, this article acquitted them, finding that they acted without discernment. This lack of discernment made a successful reintegration often seem more likely to contemporary commentators. The concept of patronage was at the core of this œuvre de réintégration. 5 characteristics re-emerged in my research on these patronage institutions: information, preservation, work, religion, and protection against recidivism. Recidivism appeared here as a pressing concern as the society feared especially the relapse of the female young offender, worrying about her dangerous sexuality. Patronage then was meant to prevent the young liberated from reoffending. She was to be surveyed beyond the end of her sentence till the age of her majority. It further introduced the possibility of an early release, and we can see this here with the Articles 9 and 15 of the Law of 1850, authorizing such a provisional release to their families or to third parties who presented guarantees of good character. Directors, in collaboration with deputy prefects, prefects of the respective département, and the Ministry of the Interior, decided on the basis of the delinquent's conduct, her family, her professional, primary, moral, religious instruction, whether they could be released before the end of their sentence. They aimed to prepare them for their return into society, assuring a professional and moral grounding. Patronage offered, in the words of French psychiatrist Félix Voisin, in 1888, the liberated a helping hand, une main secourable. I will focus on these 4 facilities today that all claim to reintegrate les filles libérées and materialized the effects of the law of 1850. In the department of the L'Oise, a public prison, La Maison Centrale du Clermont, which appears here on the right corner, held young girls till 1853. After it closed, and as an impact of the law of 1850, 2 private and secular institutions were established. Le pénitencier, or l'ouvroir de la miséricorde of Mademoiselle Ratier, the daughter of the former prison director, led here les jeunes détenus and libérés in the 1860s. The other facility, l'asile de Saint-Just-en-Chaussée, lasted only 1 year between 1870 and 1871 when its director, Madame Coulnier, was arrested on charges of abortion. Alongside these 2 secular institutions, I will look at 2 Catholic institutions. The Refuge de la Solitude de Nazareth in the south of France in Montpellier was in charge of young girls between 1847 and the 20th century and considered widely a model refuge. And the Maison du Bon Pasteur in Limoges was also praised for its exemplary reintegration of young girls, and it was active between 1849 and 1899. The director of the Solitude de Nazareth promised at its foundation that it would receive girls that had been freed to save them from deplorable suggestions, habits, and misery. Was this the case? These institutions faced problems, as the archives show us. It survived through state subsidies. The state paid, alongside annual subsidies, a fee per confined child. And when we look into the archives more closely, we see the institution faced a problem in just the decrease of these state fees or this state money. At its funding, for example, the Solitude de Nazareth de Montpellier received 80 centimes per day per inmate. As the number of girls increased, the state subsidies decreased from 80 to 60 centimes per day. In Limoges and Deloise, the situation was not much different. In Limoges, they received 80 centimes at its founding, when later it was reduced to 50 centimes and rising up to 60 centimes in the 70s again. And the letter we see here evokes the financial pressure that these decreases could cause. Madame la Supérieure de Limoges explained that the children's labor did not shed sufficient profit because of their young age and infirmity. She could not cover the costs of the facility's installation. Such pressure continues to emerge in the archives. While facilities insisted on their financial self-sufficiency, the reality did not look as rosy as reports of the Solitude, for example, might make us think. Its founder called out that his institution would not burden state finances. It would even save state money as it reduced the number of repeat offenses. The inmates of Montpellier would be, as he wrote, true miracles of moralization. But state inspection reports show that this promise did not quite match the reality. In 1864, for example, Madame l'Inspectrice Générale complained in regard to Mademoiselle Ratier's ouvroir in the Oise that alongside a very precarious financial situation, the moral culture of children who were dressed in tatters, affected by vermin, was very neglected. There were little sewing machines made of flesh and blood, and their primary education was also poorly developed. This report led to the suppression of the institution 2 years later. Reports on the Maison du Bon Pasteur du Limoges made similar claims and continued to criticize the girls' insufficient professional training. In the 1860s, the inspection also reacted to the hygienic conditions. It reported a repulsive state of dirt. Liquids from the latrine were flowing into the yard where children took their recreation and spread a foul odor. Toward the end of the century, this criticism also found its way into the press. Here we see an article of Edouard Treich, a trade unionist, accusing the nuns in charge of the Bon Pasteur of Limoges to amass incessantly. According to Treich, the nuns exploited the liberated, leaving them without any resources after they'd worked for 5, 10, 20 years within the same institution. These are, of course, individual sources that do not give us a certain representation of the past. Reading them alongside the facility's own reports, however, makes us see a divergence between the state's aims and their implementation in regard to the young liberated girls. When founded in response to the law of 1850, all 4 facilities instituted that young female delinquents should not solely be instructed in needlework, such as sewing or embroidery. Girls should be prepared to work as farm girls and domestic servants, as sewing work would push them, according to the Ministry of the Interior, to encounter serious dangers in towns. Yet sewing remained their predominant employment, as this chart, which I have drawn up from documents of the Bon Pasteur in Limoges, shows. After a rise of agricultural work between 1877 and 1887, indicated here in blue, it stopped completely in the 1880s. Sewing, marked in orange, continued to be the predominant work. Other documents show that before 1870, when the Bon Pasteur leased a farmhouse, the predominance of needlework was even more stark. Things were similar in Montpellier. In its foundation, the facility declared to choose the task according to the girl's origin. The country girl would work in the fields, while the child of the city, according to the foundation, carried out needlework. Despite this goal to prepare girls for their freedom by taking into account their origin, needlework remained also in Montpellier the predominant task. Reports and letters from the ministry continued to criticize this. We can see, therefore, that the aim of patronage, of reintegrating the liberated girl, was hampered by financial pressures. They affected the professional instruction. On the one hand, the facilities sought support with the promise of financial self-sufficiency. On the other hand, they countered decreasing state subsidies by employing girls in lucrative tasks such as sewing, rather than in an occupation that was better suited, or at least considered as better suited, for their life back in society. Further, society mistrusted the jeunes libérés to use money responsibly. So found social commentator Josephine Mallet that money would become a bait for the greed of immoral parents and the inmates who awaited impatiently. Within this institutional framework, two further components were key to the aim of reintegration: family and the outlook for a professional placement. If the facility could not keep the girl away from families that were considered immoral when she reached the age of 21 years, it made every effort to do so before. The family played a significant role in the girl's release. As Abbé Humour warned in 1878, the patronage of the liberated was naturally linked to the removal of the immoral family. The extracts remind of this importance. In the left corner on the slide, the demand of Constance Collet's mother, for example, was rejected. Though the file reads that inmate Collet conducted herself well, the mother's bad character prevented an early release. Similarly, the mother of Josephine Ariot, here in the bottom right corner, tried in vain to convince the prefect of the Hérault to release her daughter. Both the delinquent's conduct and the family's position had to be satisfactory in order to obtain an early release. Cases as that of young Marie Simon, inmate of Mademoiselle Ratier's ouvroir, who was released to her sister and her husband, according to the file, both good workers, illustrate this. And even after Madame Coulnier had left her own facility, after she was arrested on the charges of abortion, she still appealed to this reasoning centered on the family, as she wrote from prison a letter to the prefect. She was pleading for the release of Mademoiselle Desmoulies, arguing that the latter was needed by her child and her parents. If demands made by parents for the release of their daughters then were often rejected on grounds of moral and financial situation, their stories also evoke a pragmatic thinking. So granted the state, for example, the release of Cézanne Bréteau, Libérée of the Solitude, as a last consolation of seeing that child could not be denied to her old and ill parents. A professional placement was a second big component in the release of young girls. In the case of the family's bad morality or insufficient financial means, the administration placed the delinquent girl, as we saw in the beginning, with a third party. The cases of young Pétronelle Fivet and Joséphine Beauchamp, both interned in Mademoiselle Ratier's ouvroir, remind of the complexity of this aim to place someone. These two girls distinguished themselves through good conduct. As they were without moral families, the deputy prefect, however, sought a placement for them. His efforts remained unsuccessful. Even months later, Mademoiselle Ratier complained about the impossibility of finding them a placement. Both girls remained at the institution. Only months later, Fivet left to work in the shop of Widow Maupin. Such stories that continue to appear in the archives show a society that remains suspicious. The young liberated woman continued to be a frightening figure. We also see moments of resistance when we look at these case files and placements. The young Gaudie, abandoned from her father, was reintegrated into Mademoiselle Ratier's ouvroir after pharmacist Counu of Gaillon had to complain about her in 1864. Similarly, Marie Rudé, here in the right top corner, resisted her placement as a servant with Monsieur Albert in Paris and disappeared, stealing money and various movable objects. She was brought back to Clermont, where she would remain another 3 years. The case of Olympe Bertrand and Adèle Régnier, also placed with Madame Maupin, attests to the success of a placement. We can find various such cases of success in Montpellier, the Loise, Limoges that remind of Désirée Dufresne, who began this presentation. Released after a 2-year correction of vagabondage, she returned to her mother's home in Paris, where she worked in a workshop on Rue Saint-Sauveur. She wrote to Mademoiselle Ratier to thank her for the instruction that made this occupation possible. This letter is the only one written by a jeune libérée that I have found so far in my research. While it does not give, of course, any certain representation of the girl's experience, it reminds of the diverging experiences that individuals made during and after their confinement in patronage societies. Unsuccessful demands made by parents to obtain a release from their delinquent daughters, contested placements with a third party, a lasting contact between a jeune libérée and her former director. We even find documents that informed of prolonged stays of delinquent girls in the very institutions. The extracts from the cases of Marie Espic, inmate of the Solitude de Nazareth in 1880, and Anna Martineau, who was detained in Limoges in 1858, remind of this possibility. Girls were said to voluntarily stay longer in the facility they were meant to leave, or the institution could file for a prolongation of the girls' stay. The research on these societies then make us encounter different individual trajectories. While we lack indeed sources written by the girls themselves and often hear male voices, points of resistance of such decisions evoke reactions to the system. Girls did not always wait for the end of their prison sentence, or rather acquittal, if you remember Article 66, but at times tried to be released early. So they did in often the most paradoxical ways, as we see in the case of Victorine Salon. Detained under the Bon Pasteur, she wrote to the prefect of the Haute-Vienne asking to finish her time at Limoges prison because she would rather stay in prison than in a convent. And when we turn to the Solitude de Nazareth, we find the story of young Marie-Jean, who faked a pregnancy in 1867, aware of the fact that this would grant her a transfer from the refuge to the prison of Montpellier. These two cases show the girl's awareness of the system in place, similarly to young Adele here on the bottom of the slide, who resisted the administration of Montpellier by withholding information. They acted on their knowledge of the way the system worked and tried to circumvent it. This makes us see release in a second sense to the one I've discussed so far. When thinking about the beyond in the trajectories of these delinquent girls, one can turn to these points of resistance, but also escapes, evasion, when girls literally went beyond the facility's walls. Shortly before the scandal unraveled around Madame Coulnier's abortion, 3 girls escaped in September 1871. The gendarmerie report here on the left of the slide criticized the faulty conduct of the director and her establishment. I found similar instances of evasion in Montpellier. Here, young Rose Ferrand was punished after escaping to her mother's home, hiding during the day and walking only at night, as the file claimed. Evasion was also part of the Bon Pasteur in Limoges. Augustine Roux explained her and fellow inmate Estelle's escape in 1890, saying, "We simply tried to regain our freedom." And just a few months after this escape, an open revolt broke out in Limoges. After the nun sent Louise Péon into isolation for moral behavior, her fellow inmates revolted, shouting, dancing, jumping, breaking windows. According to a letter of the prefect, one of them even wanted to set fire to the convent so that she could escape more quickly. The interrogations reproduced the statements of the girls implicated in this revolt. Marie Lantier, "It's the nuns' fault because of their mistreatment." Rosalie Garin, "We rebelled because we were badly cared for." Gabrielle Despeux, "I simply did what the others did." Elise Fourceau, "I did not want to remain in the convent." These extracts remind of the diverse ways in which young delinquent girls engaged with the facilities that surrounded them. An overview of cases ranging from the secular institutions in the Loise to the Catholic refuge in Montpellier and in Limoges show that the delinquent past could haunt the liberated girls. Financial constraints could obstruct a successful professional instruction. Society's anxiety and suspicions toward the young liberated and the risk of her reoffending could prevent a placement. Her moral family might keep her longer within the establishment. A look at the institutional framework shown a discrepancy between the state goals and the implementation. But while the goal of patronage, of a reintegration into society, was at times hindered, we also read of success stories, as with Désirée Dufresne. Looking at points of resistance makes us see a further conception of freedom. A work on these institutions, therefore, draws out a multitude of individual trajectories. It draws out what freedom meant for young delinquent girls in 19th century France, what it meant to be jeune and libérée, what it meant to be beyond delinquency. Thank you very much for listening.